Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Philosophizing with a Hammer. Today we are starting a new series on existentialism, and we're going to look at the profound writings of the main existential thinkers like Dostoevsky, like Kafka, like Camus. We're going to start off by Crime and Punishment, a story packed with big questions about guilt and morality. We're going to look at how Raskolnikov's inner struggle, that is the protagonist, tell us about ideas like nihilism, the will to power, finding meaning in a chaotic world. We're going to look at how such a novel still resonates with us today, that is, the ideas behind the novel. So, before we delve into the existential themes of Crime and Punishment, let's take a moment to understand the man behind the novel, Fyodor Dostoevsky. Because his life definitely shaped his writings. Dostoevsky was born in 1821 in Moscow into a family that was financially unstable to begin with. And his early life was marked by personal loss of his mother when he was young and the emotional burden of his father's abuse. Those did definitely leave some lasting scars in his life. But perhaps one of the most significant aspects of Dostoevsky's life was the deep internal struggle that he faced, which eventually gave rise to the philosophical and existential themes that shaped his works. One of the defining moments in Dostoevsky's life came in 1849 when he was arrested for his involvement with the Petrovsky's circle. It was a group of intellectuals who discussed revolutionary ideas that challenged the Russian monarchy. And the Tsarist government at the time viewed it as a threat, and they sentenced him to death. And in a strange twist, a very strange twist of fate, just moments before he was about to face the firing squad, his sentence was commuted. And instead of execution, Dostoevsky was sent to a Siberian labor camp for 4 years, followed later by that by several more years of compulsory military service. This near-death experience, which he referred to as a great shock, had definitely a profound effect on his outlook on life, death, and morality. Dostoevsky's suffering were brutal in his lifetime. And during his years in exile, he also experienced profound psychological anguish and poverty. And a major contributor to this misery was his addiction to gambling, which plagued him for much of his life. His gambling habit drove him into extreme financial debt, forcing him to borrow money and even sell the rights to his future works. He wrote a whole novel on that called The Gambler. And he was often in dire financial straits, struggling to make ends meet. And this constant anxiety over money left him in a perpetual state of stress. This addiction, and along with poverty, were more than just material concerns for Dostoevsky. They were existential trials. His gambling became a metaphor for the human condition itself, that is, the constant tension between desire and despair, between seeking meaning and diving, let's say, falling into nihilism. Dostoevsky's personal battles with poverty and addiction provided him with an intimate understanding of suffering, a theme that would definitely resonate deeply throughout his works. In addition to these, Dostoevsky also faced a deep spiritual crisis. He was torn between his doubts and his Catholic faith. His time in Siberia, where he was exposed to the brutality of the penal system and the suffering of fellow prisoners, pushed him to reconsider his belief in God. And his years of hardship, both physical, that is, and mental, gave him a profound understanding of human suffering, a subject that would definitely become central to his literary work. And despite these immense personal struggles, Dostoevsky's writing offers more than just an exploration of despair. His works are marked by a search for meaning, a quest to find redemption in a world filled with suffering. In Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky's protagonist, Raskolnikov, grapples with his own moral failings, and his story reflects the deep existential questions that Dostoevsky himself wrestled with throughout his life. Dostoevsky's own experiences, that is, his near execution, his addiction to gambling, his poverty, his spiritual crisis, all in all, shaped his writing in profound ways. And his work is an exploration of the complexities of human nature, the tension between free will and moral responsibility. And these struggles were not just personal burdens, they were the main, let's say, fuel to his writings and his philosophical and literary genius. His works offer us a window into his own inner turmoil, and throughout the novels, his characters are shaped by the same internal struggles. Through them, we are invited to confront the most difficult and essential questions of life. Now that we have understood the profound personal struggles that shaped Dostoevsky's worldview, we can better appreciate how these themes of suffering, of guilt, they shape the core of his novel, Crime and Punishment. The journey of Raskolnikov, the novel's tortured protagonist, reflects the same existential struggles that Dostoevsky faced, illustrating the conflict between individual will and moral responsibility. And this understanding of Dostoevsky's life and legacy sets the stage for our discussion of Crime and Punishment. We'll delve into the philosophical underpinnings of the story, particularly through the lens of existentialism, and building on what we have seen from Nietzschean philosophy in previous episodes. The story of Crime and Punishment begins with Raskolnikov in a state of extreme poverty. He is brilliant, but a troubled young man. He is overwhelmed by a sense of superiority and the desire to prove himself. He believes that extraordinary people like Napoleon or great leaders have the right to commit crimes if it serves a higher purpose, such as making the world a better place. He convinces himself that by killing Alyona Ivanova, an old wealthy pawnbroker, he will be able to use the stolen money to improve his life and, by extension, do good for others. This leads him to plot her murder. Raskolnikov carefully plans the murder, but things go bad. While killing Alyona, he also is interrupted by her half-sister, Lizaveta, who unexpectedly enters the room, and in a panic moment, Raskolnikov also kills Lizaveta. This unplanned second murder weighs heavily on him. So the first few pages, 50 or something, of the novel, they were devoted to the crime, and all the rest is devoted to the punishment, which was internal and mental. And after the crime, Raskolnikov is filled with intense guilt and anxiety. He becomes paranoid and withdrawn, suffering from fever and hallucinations. His thoughts spiral as he tries to justify his actions, but deep down he is tormented by what he has done. Raskolnikov's internal struggle is a major part of the novel, as he debates whether he is a great man who is above law or just a murderer consumed by guilt. He's basically revisiting the ideas of good and evil, about right and wrong. What is right for him is not what is right for society, and vice versa. And several characters in the novel actually play important roles into the deep internal struggle that Raskolnikov had to go through. Each character represents different aspects of his moral psychological turmoil. For example, Sonia. She's a humble, self-sacrificing woman who turns to prostitution to support her family. And despite her difficult life, she remains compassionate and deeply religious. She becomes a key figure in Raskolnikov's life, offering him comfort and helping him confront his guilt. Another character, Donia, she was Raskolnikov's devoted sister. She was strong-willed and intelligent. She's engaged to a man named Luzin, who is selfish and manipulative. And Dunia's relationship with Raskolnikov is crucial, as she loves him deeply and is concerned for his well-being. You also have another main character, Petrovich, the intelligent and somewhat quirky police detective, investigating the murders, and he suspects that Raskolnikov is the one who killed the pawnbroker, but approaches him with psychological tactics, trying to get him to confess by engaging in intellectual conversation. And the last main character is Razumhin. I hope I'm really pronouncing the names correctly. Russian names can be hard to pronounce. Razumhin was Raskolnikov's loyal friend and one of the few people who genuinely cares about him. He's warm-hearted and compassionate, and he plays a crucial role in supporting Raskolnikov's psychological struggle during his moments of crisis. As the police investigation into the murders unfolds, Raskolnikov becomes increasingly paranoid, believing that he will be caught at any moment. However, he continues to try to justify his crime, telling himself that it was necessary for a greater good. At the same time, he remains isolated, unable to fully connect with those around him. And Zonia becomes a confidant for him. She encourages him to seek redemption. And despite his resistance, her unwavering compassion eventually begins to have an impact on him. Through Zonia, Raskolnikov is exposed to the idea of suffering as a path to salvation, something that he slowly starts to consider as a way to reconcile his crime. And now to the confession at the end. As Raskolnikov's guilt continues to consume him, he becomes more and more tortured by the weight of his actions. Eventually, he reaches a breaking point and confesses to the murders. He is sentenced to Siberian penal colony, where he begins to grapple with the idea of redemption. In the final chapters, Raskolnikov's journey toward redemption begins, and his time in the penal colony is not easy, but through his suffering, he starts to transform. Zonia follows him to Siberia, and her presence continues to offer him the hope of spiritual renewal. The novel ends on a note of potential change as Raskolnikov begins to realize the possibility of moral and spiritual rebirth. Crime and Punishment is ultimately a novel about the psychological torment that comes with guilt and the potential for redemption through suffering. It explores deep moral questions as whether an individual can transcend societal laws and whether there is a way to atone for the worst of sins. And through Raskolnikov's journey, Dostoevsky provides a powerful exploration of the human soul in crisis and the possibility of a redemption even for the most troubled individuals. Raskolnikov's actions and struggles in the context of Nietzsche's ideas, we start to see how his character might be both in line with and at odds with Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch. Nietzsche's Übermensch, as we have seen in previous episodes, often translates as the overman or superman. It's a person who creates their own values, stepping beyond traditional moral systems that limit individuals' freedom of basically being and expression. And the Übermensch does not adhere to the conventional laws and moral codes that govern society. Instead, they define their own path and embrace life's challenges without guilt or submission to established norms. That was just a quick reminder. If you want more details about the Overman, you can find it in episode 3 or 4. I forgot. You can just look it up, Nietzsche and the Übermensch, for further details. I would really recommend listening to the whole episode, so we can use it as a lens to continue analyzing the novel. And at the start of Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov believes himself to be one of these extraordinary individuals, a potential Übermensch. He convinces himself that his crime, that is the murder of Alyona Ivanova, is justified because it would serve a greater purpose. Like Nietzsche's Übermensch, he sees himself as above conventional moral laws, believing that he has the right to transcend the ordinary. Just like great figures like Napoleon, These great figures, they do not view their actions as bad or immoral. They view them as good because they serve for something that transcends the ordinary. However, the novel, as it unfolds, we begin to see that Raskolnikov's actions don't lead him to the freedom and greatness he expected. Instead, they lead to deep inner turmoil and guilt, showing the darker consequences of his, let's say, Nietzschean aspirations, his failed Nietzschean aspirations. Raskolnikov's suffering suggests that true transcendence is not simply about breaking moral laws. It involves confronting the consequences of one's actions and finding a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov sees himself as an extraordinary individual, someone destined for greatness. He believes he is above all the moral constraints that bind ordinary people. For Raskolnikov, the conventional moral laws that govern society, laws against murder, for instance, do not apply to someone with his intellectual and philosophical superiority. He thinks that there are certain exceptional individuals who, if they possess a higher vision or purpose, should be allowed to transgress moral boundaries in pursuit of greater good. This belief aligns with Nietzsche's idea that the Übermensch transcends traditional morality and creates his own values. And you can see in Raskolnikov's justification for committing the murder, it was built on this very premise. He argues that the murder of Alyona Ivanova will ultimately serve a greater societal purpose. He believes that by using the money he would steal from her, he would elevate his own life and achieve something meaningful. Raskolnikov envisions himself as a figure similar to Napoleon, a great leader who was willing to make tough, morally questionable decisions for the greater good. He sees himself as one of the exceptional individuals who have the right to violate moral codes if it means furthering humanity's progress. This belief in being an exceptional individual, however, doesn't just mirror Nietzsche's rejection of conventional morality. It also brings with this idea a fundamental tension that Raskolnikov cannot escape. He struggles to reconcile his grand ideas about being an extraordinary man with the brutal reality of the crime he commits. Though he tells himself that the murder is justified, he is simply acting as a catalyst for change and so on and so forth. He still cannot fully silence the internal guilt and horror that follow. His belief in his superiority and right to kill is in constant conflict with the deep sense of shame and unease that overtakes him. This inner turmoil that he feels echoes Nietzsche's view on the struggle between individual will and societal norms. Nietzsche emphasized the importance of the individual's will to power, that is, the drive to assert oneself and shape the world according to one's values. However, Nietzsche also acknowledged the tension that arises when individuals break free from societal constraints. The struggle between acting on one's desires and confronting the consequences of doing so is central to Raskolnikov's experience. Just like Nietzsche's Übermensch, who seeks to transcend traditional morality, Raskolnikov finds himself facing a painful struggle as he begins to realize that freedom from conventional moral laws comes at a heavy personal cost. You see, Raskolnikov's internal conflict mirrors Nietzsche's exploration of the tension between the individual will to power and the weight of societal expectations. Although Raskolnikov initially believes that his intellect and philosophical vision justify his action, yet the moral consequences of his crime is inescapable. In this sense, Raskolnikov embodies Nietzsche's anti-hero. A figure who believes in his own expectations and, let's say, exceptionalism, but whose internal contradictions and moral struggles reveal the complexities of living outside traditional moral boundaries. Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of the will to power is central to his philosophy and often misunderstood as a mere desire for domination or control. We have talked about that with the episode of Nietzsche and the will to power, how it was misunderstood by figures like Hitler. I'm still in doubt whether it was misunderstood or falsified. Either way, it was misused. However, the idea of the will to power is much deeper and more nuanced. It actually represents the fundamental drive that all individuals possess to assert their strength, overcome challenges. And it is not limited to physical power or domination, but encompasses a broader notion of self-mastery, a notion of creativity. And the will to power, in Nietzsche's view, that is the force that drives individuals to rise above mediocrity and realize their true potential. It is the essence of becoming who one truly is, unburdened by external constraints or conventional morality. For Nietzsche, the will to power is a dynamic force. It is constantly in flux, always pushing individuals to expand their horizons, question their limitations, and redefine what is possible. It manifests not just in physical acts of strength, but in intellectual ones. The will to power involves the struggle to create one's own values, to transcend the boundaries set by society, by religion, or tradition, and to live authentically according to one's own principles. In this context, power is not about domination over others, but about mastering oneself and asserting one's own unique vision of the world. Raskolnikov's desire to assert his power, to break free from societal constraints, can be viewed as an embodiment of his will to power, though it is a distorted and misguided expression of it. And throughout the novel, Raskolnikov grapples with his sense of insignificance in society that has seemingly crushed his spirit. He feels alienated from the world around him, burdened by his poverty and disillusioned with the moral systems that govern his life. His intellectual superiority drives him to reject the conventional moral laws that society imposes on him. And in his mind, the rules of society are for the weak. They are for the common, for the slaves, in a Nietzschean sense. Raskolnikov's desire to break free from them reflects the main idea in Nietzsche's philosophy, the will to power. For Raskolnikov, Society's rules, especially those about right and wrong, are suffocating, and he believes that by asserting his will and committing murder, he can finally liberate himself from the oppressive expectations that surround him. In his eyes, his intellect, his ambition, and his vision for a greater future make him worthy of bypassing the usual moral codes. His crime is not just a means to acquire wealth, but, let's say, an attempt to break through the boundaries set by society and demonstrate his mastery over the world around him. His desire to act beyond the law, to step into the realm of the extraordinary, is an attempt to seize control over his own fate, to reject conventional morality that defines his existence, to go, as Nietzsche says, beyond good and evil. Raskolnikov's crime, as seen in the novel, in a sense, a test of his own will to power. And by committing the murder, he is not just trying to achieve a practical goal, that is acquiring money, although that's how it seems like explicitly, but also it's a test for the strength of his will and his ability to act beyond the moral framework that governs ordinary people. Because remember, the original question in Crime and Punishment was Raskolnikov's inner soliloquies: am I doing the right thing? Or is that just the wrong thing because society says so? He wants to see if he is capable of transcending conventional morality and asserting his dominance over others, and he believes that by committing the crime, he will prove himself that he is capable of greatness. However, this test of the will to power is not as straightforward as Raskolnikov's believes. Throughout the novel, we see that the will to power is not something that can be easily asserted without consequence. Raskolnikov's crime is an immediate failure of his will to power, because it does not provide him with the liberation or empowerment he anticipated. Instead, it leads to a profound psychological and emotional crisis. The very act of committing the crime begins to unravel him. His internal conflict and guilt consume him. He is unable to reconcile the power he sought to assert with the moral weight of his actions, which he cannot escape. What Raskolnikov fails to see and to realize is that his crime does not empower him in the way he hoped, but instead thrusts him into a state of intense psychological suffering, forcing him to confront the limits of his own power. The tension between Raskolnikov's intellectual beliefs about power and the reality of his crime underscores the complex nature of the will to power itself. It is not simply about asserting one's will to dominate, but also about grappling with the moral, emotional shape of a human existence. To understand the depth of Raskolnikov's internal conflict, it is helpful to explore Nietzsche's concept of the slave and the master morality. These two moral systems, as we have discussed before in previous episodes, they represent diametrically opposed ways of understanding good and evil. Nietzsche describes master morality as the set of values associated with the powerful and noble individuals who define their own sense of right and wrong. In this view, power is, along with strength, it's virtuous, while weakness, submission, and humility are seen as vices. The masters of this system are those who are not bound by societal norms and who create their own values through acts of strength and will. In contrast, slave morality is a moral system that arises from the resentment of the weak and oppressed. Nietzsche argues that this system valorizes, let's say, qualities such as humility, such as meekness, virtues that serve to uphold the status quo and maintain control over those who are not in power. In slave morality, actions are judged by their adherence to societal rules and the emphasis on compassion and selflessness. It is a morality that values conformity, and it is often at the expense of the individual will and personal strength. Raskolnikov's moral crisis can be seen as a clash between these two. Initially, he believes himself to be a master, someone who is above traditional moral codes. He views the murder of Alyona Ivanova as a way to free himself from the constraints of slave morality, justifying his crime by asserting his power and intellectual superiority. He believes that by committing the murder, he is acting in a way that is aligned with the values of the masters, asserting his will to power, much like the Übermensch. However, his descent into guilt and madness reveals the deep tension between these two moral systems. The values of slave morality and the societal norms that condemn murder and emphasize the sanctity of life begins to overpower actually his initial defiance. His guilt is not simply a moral reaction to the crime itself, but a manifestation of the overwhelming force of societal morality. Raskolnikov feels a deep existential anguish because he is unable to fully escape the moral framework that has been ingrained in him. His crime, which he initially saw as an act of power, becomes an inescapable source of self-torture, let's say. The conflict between his belief in master morality and the guilt imposed by slave morality drives him further into madness. And Raskolnikov's path is one of self-destruction, not self-overcoming. That is, as we described it earlier, a failed will to power. His inability to transcend the moral laws he once sought to defy results in his psychological disintegration. And this contrast is crucial in understanding the philosophical depth of crime and punishment. While Nietzsche's concept of a self-overcoming, it emphasizes the ability to face challenges, including guilt, and use them to create new values, Raskolnikov's failure to do so highlights the limitations of his Nietzschean aspirations. Although he fails, he seeks power and freedom by defying societal norms, but ultimately finds himself trapped by them. His inability to embrace his guilt and transform it into something productive is the key factor that prevents him from overcoming himself and leading himself to his eventual breakdown. Nietzsche's ideal of self-overcoming here is not about avoiding suffering. No, it's about confronting it head on and using it to forge a new possibility for the self. We talked about the self-overcoming in previous episodes. We explained how Nietzsche's ideas are not leading us into nihilism as many people misunderstand. Nietzsche is trying to overcome that. Nietzsche is saying something like, okay, life is bad, life is harsh, no denial, but let's look at the good side. He is overcoming the idea set by his mentor, Arthur Schopenhauer. And Raskolnikov, on the other hand, avoids this process. His descent into madness represents a failure to truly engage with complexities of life. Also, the complexities of human suffering. He never fully accepts the consequences of his crime or his role within society, which prevents him from transcending his guilt. And his inability to overcome his inner turmoil contrasts sharply with Nietzsche's vision of the individual as someone who constantly pushes past their limitations and redefines their existence. In the end, Raskolnikov's journey is not one of self-overcoming but self-destruction. The tension between Nietzsche's philosophy of personal growth and Raskolnikov's tragic failure highlights the novel's exploration of the limits of individual will and the complexities of moral transformation. While Nietzsche sees guilt and suffering as opportunities for growth, Raskolnikov's inability to rise above them ultimately traps him in a cycle of despair, illustrating the dark side of the human condition when one fails to reconcile the individual will with the weight of moral responsibility. Zonia serves in the novel as a pivotal figure who provides both a counterpoint to Raskolnikov's nihilistic ideal and a source of hope for his potential redemption. Her unwavering Christian compassion, which embodies forgiveness, stands in stark contrast to Raskolnikov's Nietzschean philosophy of the self-overcoming. Her role in the novel complicates the Nietzschean framework we have explored, raising important questions about the nature of morality and the possibility of transformation through love and compassion. We can look at Zonia as a symbol of Christian compassion. She represents the values of Christian compassion along with humility and forgiveness. As a prostitute, she had lived a life marked by hardships and suffering, yet she maintains a deep faith in God and is constantly guided by a moral compass rooted in Christian charity. Her life is an embodiment of unconditional love and self-sacrifice, qualities that are in direct opposition to Raskolnikov's belief in the exceptional man who stands above societal laws and is free to create his own values. And her love for Raskolnikov is profound and unwavering, even in the face of his crime and his emotional distance. She does not judge him for his actions, but instead offers him compassion and understanding. In many ways, Zonia becomes the moral anchor of the novel. Her ability to forgive Raskolnikov, despite his monstrous act as he committed, it symbolizes the Christian virtue of grace, which is not earned but freely given. And Zonia's role as a compassionate figure contrasts sharply with Raskolnikov's rejection of the conventional morality and his desire to live beyond the constraints of society's laws. In Zonia's presence, Raskolnikov begins to confront the possibility of redemption, a notion that he seems to reject in the beginning, but later on he falls into. And her love does not demand anything in return, and it is precisely this selfless love that begins to penetrate the walls that he had built around himself. Her belief in the redemptive power of love and her deep faith challenged Raskolnikov's nihilism and forced him to confront the very moral system he has tried to reject. To fully understand the tension between Raskolnikov's beliefs and Zonia's role in the novel, it is necessary to consider Nietzsche's critique of Christianity. Nietzsche famously referred to Christianity as slave morality. It values humility and meekness. He saw Christian morality as life-denying, as it encouraged individuals to reject their instincts. Christianity, according to Nietzsche, promotes a mindset of weakness and submission, one that suppresses the natural impulses of the individual in favor of moral doctrines that seek to constrain human potential. And from a Nietzschean perspective, Zonia's forgiveness and selflessness might appear to be weakness. Her willingness to suffer for others and to forgive without question, her acceptance of her own suffering might be seen as an act of resignation, a denial of the will to power that Nietzsche so deeply values. Zonia's moral code, rooted in Christian principles. It operates the premise that love, regardless of individual desire, is paramount. Nietzsche would view this as antithesis to his ideal of the Übermensch who transcends these values. For Raskolnikov, Zonia represents the very values he seeks to escape, the moral systems of obedience. He has spent much of the novel distancing himself from the ideals, seeking instead to prove his own expectationalism, let's say, and assert his will to power over the world. And Zonia's love challenges this worldview directly. Whereas Raskolnikov seeks power through isolation and rejection of morality, Zonia finds strength in compassion, connection, and sacrifice. Her love doesn't require him to prove his greatness or transcend morality. It is simply forcing him into to question whether true greatness lies in the ability to transcend the human limitations or in the capacity for love and humility. Zonia's influence is very profound on Raskolnikov. It represents a direct challenge to his Nietzschean worldview, despite the intellectual belief in the idea of the Übermensch. And the dynamic tension between Raskolnikov's beliefs of the individualism and the idea of moral redemption is created in that moment. As Raskolnikov's journey unfolds, it becomes clear that his eventual acceptance of Zonia's love signifies a profound shift in his worldview. This shift does not necessarily represent a full departure from his Nietzschean ideals, but rather a moment of introspection and reconciliation between two opposing forces, that is, the individual will and the possibility of collective redemption through love. And by the novel's conclusion, Raskolnikov has come to understand that true redemption may not lie in the rejection of conventional morality, but in the acceptance of love and the capacity for self-forgiveness. We can view this one as Raskolnikov's shift towards accepting the love and the resignation of Zonia's role as a moral transformation that reflects a nuanced interplay between Nietzsche's philosophy and the Christian values that Zonia represents. As we have explored throughout this episode, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is a complex narrative that grapples with the tension between individual will and moral responsibility, an existential struggle that can be examined through the lens of Nietzsche's philosophy. Raskolnikov, the central figure, embodies the quintessential Nietzschean anti-hero. He believes his own exceptionalism is gonna lead him somewhere, viewing himself as someone above traditional moral laws, a person who can transgress these laws in the name of a higher purpose. Yet his internal conflict, his descent into guilt, and the influence of characters like Zonia highlight the limitations of Nietzschean ideals when confronted with the complexity of human morality and the need for redemption. Throughout the novel, Raskolnikov's journey demonstrates the destructive power of the will to power when it is detached from any sense of moral responsibility or empathy for others. His attempt to create his own values and transcend societal norms through murder ultimately leads to suffering and guilt, and at the end, madness. Even as he clings to his Nietzschean worldview, he cannot escape the weight of his actions. This internal struggle echoes Nietzsche's own concept of self-overcoming, where the individual must constantly battle against the constraints of societal and traditional morality. However, in Raskolnikov's case, this victory that he seeks through self-overcoming becomes intertwined with an inescapable guilt, raising the question of whether the Nietzschean hero can ever truly transcend moral responsibility. As a personal point of view, it's not about the question of whether the Nietzschean hero can truly transcend the moral responsibility. It's about how the Nietzschean hero can transcend the moral responsibility. And we can see that Raskolnikov failed to do so because he fell prey into the nihilism that Nietzsche warned about. And second, he opted to the easier option, which is following the traditional moralities that is embodied within Christianity. And the presence of Zonia with her Christian compassion complicates the journey. Raskolnikov's belief in his own superiority and his right to commit murder for the greater good is not a Nietzschean trait to begin with. It is a caricature. Nietzsche's Overmen doesn't justify violence with utilitarian calculus. Instead, they embody a profound personal transformation that uplifts humanity through creativity and authenticity. And Raskolnikov, in contrast, lacks the psychological strength and clarity to embody these ideals. His crime is not an act of creation, but destruction. He doesn't transcend morality, he's crushed by it. And Raskolnikov's descent into nihilism is his greatest error. Nietzsche saw nihilism as a danger, a stage that must be overcome. He warned us against falling into the abyss of meaninglessness. Raskolnikov, unable to reconcile his actions with his conscience, spirals into self loathing, and instead of creating new values, he becomes a prisoner of his guilt. This is the antithesis of Nietzsche's vision. Critics might argue that Nietzsche's ideas, like the Übermensch, inherently lead to figures like Raskolnikov, but this is a shallow reading. Nietzsche's philosophy is not a license for moral anarchy. It is a call to transcendence. Raskolnikov's failure is not Nietzsche's failure. It is a failure to understand Nietzsche. And Dostoevsky, in his exploration of morality and guilt, creates a cautionary tale, not a repudiation of Nietzsche's ideals. In the end, Raskolnikov's story is a tragedy, not of Nietzschean philosophy, but of its misinterpretation. He believed himself to be a higher man, but fell into the abyss of nihilism. Nietzsche would remind us that he who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster, and if you gaze long enough into the abyss will gaze back to you. Very beautiful, beautifully said by Nietzsche. And Raskolnikov gazed too long. Let this story serve as a reminder, not of Nietzsche's failure, but of the responsibility that comes with embracing the challenge of creating one's own value. In sum, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment teaches us that life is complex, filled with moral ambiguities, and that we cannot escape the consequences of our actions. However, the novel also suggests that there is hope for transformation and that through self awareness, we can navigate the tensions between finding meaning in a seemingly indifferent world. As we can reflect on Raskolnikov's journey, we see a stark warning against the seduction of nihilism. His belief in transcendent morality through sheer will led not to greatness, but to despair and alienation. In Nietzschean terms, Raskolnikov fails because he misunderstands what it means to seek greatness. True greatness isn't found in defying humanity, but in embracing it, overcoming oneself through creativity and the pursuit of life-affirming values. Let us learn from his failure. Rather than falling into the abyss of nihilism, we must forge our own meaning and strive to embody the Übermensch. This isn't a rejection of morality, but a call to transcend conventional thinking and create a path that celebrates our potential. Thank you all for making it till the end. I appreciate your support. I'd like to hear your opinion, your feedback about this episode, so please consider leaving a comment and share your ideas, your thoughts, your critiques maybe. Don't forget to follow and rate the show so it can appear for others too. Maybe share it to someone who can find it meaningful. Until next time, signing off.